Glittering chandeliers cast their fire upon silks and powdered wigs as laughter echoed through the banquet hall. At the center, Prince Edward, restless with arrogance, pointed toward a servant girl in plain homespun, her hands still trembling from carrying wine. "If you play that piano, I'll marry you," he mocked, his cruel smile drawing jeers from the noble crowd. All eyes turned to Eleanor, a peasant child of the fields, cornered before the polished fortepiano, like prey before a beast. None knew that when her fingers touched those keys, the night itself would change forever. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The candles lifted their small suns as if the room had two skies, one glittering from the chandeliers, the other reflected in the mirrored walls. 100 flames hummed against crystal and gilt. Eleanor balanced a salver beneath that glow and told her hands to be steady. Sweat pricked along her hairline where steam from below stairs had curled the loose strands that never obeyed pins. She kept her eyes on the rim of the goblet she was refilling, not on the women whose silk rustled like grass in a summer meadow, not on the men whose powdered wigs flashed like pale helmets whenever they turned to show a profile they knew by heart. The fortepiano sat near the dais with its lid closed, a black swan among swans, pretending it was furniture, pretending it had no voice. Eleanor kept catching the shape of it out of the corner of her eye, the way a child notices a church door, even when scolded to look away. The instrument looked newly polished. A faint scent of varnish rose from it when she passed, like a promise she had no right to hear. "Mind the edge," the house steward murmured as she slipped along the wall. He did not look at her face. His gaze traveled on its own schedule, checking decanters, watching the footmen, scanning the ranks of guests. "Keep to the periphery. Do not be seen unless required." She wanted to say that was all she had ever done in houses like this. Instead, she dipped her head and moved on, counting steps between tables, noting where a chair leg jutted, where a discarded fan lay with its sticks spread like a small injured bird. Music from the assembled players threaded the air. A violin traced a polite tune that allowed conversations to bloom. The melody was careful, as if apologizing for interrupting. Eleanor found the shape of it as she worked, sang it under her breath with no sound, felt it in the way her fingers adjusted the salver to keep the weight balanced. The ordinary power of a cadence. Even while carrying wine, one could hear a cadence and stand taller. In her parish, she had done this with psalms when the curate's voice went thin. She had done it with the old instrument whose keys were worn smooth by hands that had worked fields. She had done it where no chandeliers shivered, where candlelight came in uneven scraps. She reached the head of a side table and paused, because a man had placed his sleeve across the cloth like a barricade and did not think to move it. She lowered the salver a fraction and waited for him to register that the world included more than his cuff. He did not. She shifted, slipped past, and set the decanter where a hand would spy it without seeing the hand that put it there. Beyond the shimmer at the center of the room, the prince sat with his glass tilted to study the light, rather than to drink. Eleanor only knew him because everyone did. He had the look of someone accustomed to command. A jaw that rested as if carved into readiness, a mouth taught to lift or tighten by degrees. He listened to people as if they were finished speaking before they began. Tonight, he wore boredom, like a garment that suited him too well. He smiled when addressed, but his attention slid away, searching for something worth the trouble of feeling. Eleanor felt the tug of his gaze once when she crossed behind a line of chairs and lifted a bowl out of a maid's path. It startled her, not because a prince looked at her, because he looked like a man who had recognized a chord he could not name. "Keep moving," the house steward said softly at her shoulder. She did. And yet the sense of having been seen remained, as if caught in the hairs along her arms. She set a roll on a small plate for a woman whose powdered hair cast a pale nimbus over her face. She stepped around two gentlemen debating the price of a ship as if it were a thing bought and shelved, not a keel that had met weather and sound. She counted her steps to keep calm. She did not look at the fortepiano again, or tried not to. The players ended their piece with a courteous cadence that asked no more of anyone than the polite opening of a fan. Conversation grew brighter, fed by brandy, by gossip, by the ease of people who knew their places and liked them. Eleanor lifted her empty salver to chest height and angled it against her ribs, the way she had learned to carry weight without showing strain. She turned toward the passage, thinking to trade it for a fresh one, and saw the prince stand. He rose in a way that made the room hush a quarter step. Not silence, yet something close enough to make the gaps between words feel cool. Eleanor slowed. The master of ceremonies, who had been watching for precisely that kind of movement, angled himself into view near the dais. Fans stilled. The violinist lifted his bow a hair and held it, waiting. The prince smiled as if to apologize for the interruption, and then did not apologize. He looked out over faces arranged to flatter. His gaze slid, returned, found the thing that had unsettled him. It landed on the fortepiano, then on the girl who had been trying not to see it. "Forgive me," he said, and what he meant was, "I am weary." The laughter that came back was the polite laughter of people trained to accept that boredom in a prince needs entertainment, the way a hearth needs fuel. He let it warm him a moment, then carried it with him to the brink of cruelty. "You there," he said, voice light as if speaking to a child he'd found in a corridor where children did not belong. "You handle those decanters as if they were eggs. A delicate touch. Tell me." Now he widened his attention to recruit the room. "Can you handle those keys with the same care?" Eleanor did not answer because he had not asked a question that wanted one. She could have lowered her head and let the house steward rescue her with a bow and a murmured excuse. She could have retreated through the servant's door and down into the heat where steam erased faces and gave no offense to anyone. She could have pretended not to hear. The room made it difficult to remember any of those doors existed. Laughter this time, cut more cleanly. It sought blood. People leaned in, drawn by the scent. The prince looked at the fortepiano as if he might have to play it himself if she did not. He did not move. The master of ceremonies took one careful step, two, gauging whether to divert. The house steward was at Eleanor's elbow without touching her. His breath clipped the words short. "Do not make trouble." Eleanor's fingers held the edge of the salver until they ached. She had never been accustomed to the kind of fear that makes one feel small in one's own bones. She was built to lift, to carry, to keep. Yet fear now taught her its vocabulary. It tightened the throat. It found the heart with its knuckles. It made the floor a place full of chances to fall. "Speak," the prince said, though he did not wait for speech. "Play us a tune, girl. If you play that piano, I'll marry you." The line landed like a dropped plate. It shattered in the laughter. People covered their mouths only to make the sound seem sharper. Eleanor heard one woman's whisper flicker. "Marry. Hear him. Marry. Listen." She could have cried, which would have given them the story they wanted, the easy one where humiliation is a lesson and laughter a law. She breathed instead. The air smelled of wax, of citrus oil rubbed into wood, of wine that had heated in a hand. "If your highness will permit," the master of ceremonies began, feeling for a path to turn the jest into nothing, the way a stagehand sweeps sawdust over a spill. The prince lifted a hand, and approval flowed as if his hand were the source of all rightness in the room. "Let the instrument be opened," he said. The way he said it told the room that this little theatre delighted him, that he could afford to find delight in it. 2 footmen moved at once. The fortepiano's lid rose with a hinge sigh. The action of it, the innards of the sound, waited in the dim like a thing asleep. The fallboard was eased back to show the ivory. A single key, brushed by accident, answered with a small, polite cry. Eleanor heard that thin cry and wanted to put her finger on it, to soothe, to say yes, "I hear you." "Go on," the house steward murmured, harsh because he was frightened. Frightened of what would be said of his management if she caused chaos. Frightened of what high people do when their evenings go awry. Her name existed on a list he carried in his mind and not on his tongue. She found odd comfort in that. In rooms where she did not belong, it was safer not to be called anything at all. It made it easier to be what she was expected to be, hands without a story. She walked forward because somebody had asked her to do something, and when asked, she did it. That was all. The room turned its face as one. The silk rustled in agreement. The violins at rest looked like swans with their heads behind their wings. The parquet floor kept its own counsel and gave back her soft steps without telling the whole world what her feet felt. Halfway there, she hesitated. Not because she doubted the instrument, because she understood the magnitude of the room's wish to see someone stumble. The desire in it felt like weather, not malice. Storms do not hate. They simply go where they are bent to go. "Shall we wait all night?" The prince was smiling again, lazy and cruel together, the way a cat looks at movement in grass. Eleanor did not bow. She had been taught to curtsy before a gentleman, to curtsy low before a peer, to kneel if a priest must bless her. There were a dozen movements she did with her body when authority walked in. Tonight, moving toward the instrument was all she could add. She took the last few steps and put her hands by her sides and waited for someone to behave exactly as they believed they would. "Sit," the master of ceremonies said quietly, as if telling a bird to land on a tame perch. She sat. The bench was too smooth. Her weight made a sound against the wood that seemed louder than it was. She placed the salver on the floor by her foot with care, as if the safety of the room depended upon whether glass touched wood. Her skirts were coarse and caught against the polished leg when she turned a fraction. She tucked the cloth beneath her knees. Her hands hovered. The ivory looked warm, as if the candles had given it heat. She tried one key, felt the resistance, the small resistance of something built for a certain pressure. She pressed harder, found where the tone would lift. The sound she made did not scold. It greeted her as though it had been waiting for a voice. "Make it brief," the house steward murmured from somewhere behind her, because he could not stop himself from protecting the evening that was already broken. Eleanor thought of the parish vestry, where she had touched a cracked keyboard with calloused fingers, thinking to slip through a melody before anyone noticed. She thought of the traveling teacher who had once looked at her hands and said not unkindly that they were for work, and then taught her to read a line anyway. She thought of rain in the gutters outside her home, and the way the summer wind carried the smell of turned soil through a lane at dusk. She thought of how music catches a day and holds it still for a moment, and lets a person stand inside it and say this is what it was to be alive then. She lifted her hands and began with a scale, because that is how you walk into a house you were not invited to enter. You step onto the threshold with something simple that shows your feet know how to be careful. The scale found the edges of the instrument. It traced the promise of what could be done. It taught the hammers her weight. She added a turn, then let the turn become a small answer to itself. A left-hand line anchored the floor. A right hand spoke lightly at first, the way one speaks in a church where one does not know where one is allowed to stand. The note stitched a quiet seam. Conversation faltered and did not yet cease, but the sound of silks shifted from chatter to a rustle of people moving their attention with their bodies. The first phrase ended with an open question, and she answered it differently than she had first intended, because the instrument showed her where it liked to lean. She heard someone snort, heard the small crack of a fan hit closed against a palm. She did not change the tempo to please them. She did not hurry. Men who traded ships could discover what patience was. As she moved into a figure that sounded like a minuet, if one listened with an ear that loves rules, she tucked a shadow beneath it, something minor, with a bend that made the candlelight feel cooler on the skin. She took the polite shape and made it tell the truth of a day when the sky will not make up its mind. She did not know if she could do this again. She did not know if she should. She had learned what one must not show the world, but the room asked. And in asking, it forfeited its right to pretend it did not care for the answer. She heard the violinist exhale. The bow whispered against a string, maybe by accident, maybe because he wished to follow and had to stop himself with an effort. She understood the hunger in his restraint. She had been taught restraint as a kind of survival. That night, she made restraint speak. The prince stood where he could see her hands and her face at once. He watched as if he could see the music pass through her living shape. He had not expected the ache in his chest to loosen when she started. He had certainly not expected the first hot bloom of shame that spread through him when he sensed that his words had been a stone and her answer a well, and he had thrown the stone into himself. "Who taught you?" someone whispered close behind him. He did not turn. "Listen," he said, and did not know to whom he said it. A woman at the second table near the dais had gone still. Her fan paused mid-air and remained like a bird surprised into immobility. A gentleman who fancied himself a connoisseur of taste looked around to see if others were moved so that he could safely be moved as well. The house steward held his breath and counted the beats as if timing a roast that would burn if left too long. Eleanor slipped the minor shadow aside and let the melody return to a line that reassured the company that they were not in danger. Then she turned it again, lightly, just enough to remind them that safety is not the same as truth. She kept her wrists loose, let the tone travel, allowed the sound to bloom and fade without clutching at it like a miser. She resolved a cadence with the smallest delay and heard it land in the room like a held breath let out. She did not look at the prince, because she had no time to look at a man if she meant to keep the structure of the piece intact while letting the feeling suit the room and not betray her. She let his presence press against the edge of her attention, as one allows heat to touch a hand without burning it. "Enough," someone said softly near the doors to the corridor, and the word sounded like envy wrapped in courtesy. She closed her first thought, then opened a second, brief so as not to turn performance into defiance. The second was more fragile, a thread that might break if touched roughly, the way a memory is ruined if one tells it in the wrong voice. She played it anyway. The room held still again, the large collective animal of it listening with its ears pinned. When she finished, she did not flood the silence with sound. She let the last note settle. The fortepiano hummed against her fingertips as if to thank her for being exact. She lifted her hands a finger's width, and then a little more, and then she laid them in her lap and folded them to stop the trembling. The quiet extended because people had to travel from surprise to decision and did not know the road. A cough struck like a pebble against glass. Then nothing. The master of ceremonies shifted, undecided whether to command applause or allow it to rise of its own accord and thus risk it not rising at all. The prince's expression altered by degrees, a man recovering from a jest that had unmade him. He could not decide what was most dangerous, the room's silence or his heart's relief. Eleanor did not move away from the bench. She had learned that the moment after a piece ends is when the world decides what it has heard. If one stands too quickly, one looks like a thief who has taken something. If one lingers, one looks like a beggar who wants the coin of praise. She remained, not humble, not proud, simply present. She felt the wood at her back and the weight of the air on her neck. From the corridor, something shifted. Not a draft, not the thump of a late footman's shoe, but the particular hush that comes when duty walks and people who know its step pull themselves into shape without having to be told. Eleanor felt it before she saw it. The candle flame seemed to lean toward the doorway, as if drawn by a hand. The Lord Chamberlain, pale as if he had had to swallow his own misgivings to come, appeared first. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence announced that the hallway had been cleared, that the rooms beyond the ballroom had arranged themselves as courtiers arrange themselves when a greater gravity enters. A ribbon of bows and curtsies traveled ahead of the person who had commanded them. The laughter that had cut so sharply earlier had no place to sit now. It slid off chairs and hid under tables and was not brave enough to show its face. People turned toward the doors as if to a tide. The master of ceremonies drew himself a fraction taller. He raised his staff an inch and did not tap it. Eleanor's skin prickled with the memory of peaches in August and the sense that you must not bruise them. She placed her hands one over the other on her gown to hide that they had begun to tremble in earnest. She looked at the fortepiano's keys because they were the only white things in the room that did not judge. The prince did not retreat. He did not step forward. He squared himself in the way he had been taught to do when another's arrival would require him to be something he was not yet sure he could be. His mouth flattened. His eyes did something new. They softened because he could not help himself, and then they trained themselves back into a proper attention. At the threshold, framed between carved doors and a border of faces pulled tight by uncertainty, the Queen Mother appeared. She did not enter at once. She took in the tableau, the instrument open, the girl at the bench, the prince standing as if he had just discovered that a jest can grow teeth. She weighed the room's breath. She lifted one gloved hand, palm angled in a summons that would alter the night. The master of ceremonies moved at the Queen Mother's signal, the silver head of his staff catching candlelight, as if it had been polished for this exact interruption. Conversation thinned at once. The room pulled its edges inward, becoming an antechamber to judgment rather than a ballroom devoted to ease. The Queen Mother did not sit. She allowed the expectation of her posture to tell the company that the incident was unfinished business, not a charming disruption. The Lord Chamberlain bent to her ear and spoke low. Eleanor could not hear the words, only their shape. A brief history of a jest, a servant, a performance that had turned amusement into reckoning. Eleanor kept her hands folded in her lap so the tremor would not show. Her fingers had been steadier on the keys than they were now with nothing to do. The fortepiano waited open, its strings a quiet rumor above the hammers. It had felt like an ally a moment ago. Now, it sat like a witness. "Name," said the house steward without looking at her, the way one speaks to the ledger itself, and not to the person whose life is being added up. She answered with the simplest form of it. Her voice came out even and unreal to her own ear, as if carried by the polished wood. "Where placed for the night," he said. "Ballroom service," she said. "By request." That last word slipped out and she regretted it. Requests smelled like presumption in rooms like this. The house steward flinched a fraction, aware now that he might have to account for that request to someone who could decide whether it counted as disobedience. He raised his eyes toward the dais and waited to be summoned or spared. The Queen Mother's gaze moved from the prince to the instrument, to the girl at the bench, measuring each as a problem and as a solution. Her face did not instruct, it weighed. She extended her gloved hand, 2 fingers slightly out, and the master of ceremonies advanced. "Your Majesty," he said. "Proceed," she said, and the single word put the evening back into the language of order. The master of ceremonies turned, pitched his voice so that it traveled without seeming to be thrown. "Silence," he announced, and the orchestra stilled as if someone had pinched the sound itself. A footman, quick because he knew who paid his wages, came to the Lord Chamberlain's side. "Fetch the steward of music," the Lord Chamberlain said. "Now." The footman vanished through the door near the musician's dais, headed toward the small room where the evening's parts lay in neat stacks, ink still fresh. The Kapellmeister was already on his feet a few paces away, careful to place himself within sight, but not within argument. He inclined his head to the Queen Mother. His eyes found Eleanor and did something she had not expected. They softened with recognition, not of her person, but of the line she had drawn through the air with sound. "Her touch is true," he said, when the Lord Chamberlain's glance permitted speech. "The instrument is sound. Nothing amiss." "Noted," the Lord Chamberlain said, and wrote nothing, because certain notes live better in the air. "Who is responsible for placing this girl in the presence of the instrument?" The Queen Mother's voice did not rise, yet the question reached the corners of the room. It shook loose answers like fruit from a branch. "I, ma'am," the house steward said, stepping forward as if stepping into a wind. "She asked to be in the ballroom rather than below. I allowed it, thinking." He stopped on that cliff and chose not to continue. "Thinking," she prompted. "That it would be simple," he said. It was not. A laugh, quickly suffocated, broke somewhere near the anteroom. The master of ceremonies turned his head in that direction without moving his body. The sound died as if someone had put a finger to the lips of the room. Eleanor stood when the master of ceremonies lifted his staff to indicate that she should. Her knees felt cold and then hot. Her apron had a crease she had not noticed before. She smoothed it, because there are times when one cannot smooth anything but cloth. The junior clerk from the Lord Chamberlain's office, face pink with importance, stepped close enough that she could see the stitching on his cuff. "Parish," he said. She gave it, the one where she had learned to make a psalm do more than occupy the air. "Patron," he said. "I have none," she answered. The absence hung between them like a thing that should be there and was not. "References," he said, and a small triumph lived behind the word, because among papers and seals, these questions decide whether a person is allowed to exist in the rooms where papers matter. "The curate would know me," she said, and felt the limits of that answer. "The housekeeper can say where I worked this last month." The housekeeper stepped forward, righteous in her realm. "She is capable," the housekeeper said. "Not a chatterer. Keeps her own counsel. I put her above because she does not drop things." An odd recommendation. And yet, in that moment, perhaps the most persuasive. A girl who does not drop things. "Hands," the clerk said. Eleanor lifted them. He was not looking for cleanliness. He searched for a single story written in callous and cuticle. The pads of her fingers told it anyway, thickened where ivory demands repetition, healed slices from kitchen knives, a burn that had not scarred badly because she had cooled it quick in the scullery basin and set no fuss about it. The clerk's eyes narrowed, counting marks like proof. "Enough," the Queen Mother said, and the word spared Eleanor from being asked to display herself like a cut of cloth. The prince had not spoken, not because he could not. Because each sentence that came to mind felt like a thread that would tangle if he touched it. He had meant to be amused. Now, he found himself studying the place where the laughter had been as one examines a chair after a guest has risen from it. "Your words," the Queen Mother said, turning her head toward him enough to include him and exclude no one else. "They were spoken before witnesses." "A jest," he answered calmly, and the way he said it told her how much of that calm was practiced. "A public one," she said, "which makes it less private to retract." A rustle passed through the company at that last word. Retract. It suggested the evening might yet be folded back into its box. It suggested that this could be made a story with neat edges. Eleanor tasted the word and found it bitter. She had never been able to retract a day once it had begun. The master of ceremonies took a small step forward. "Shall we resume the program?" he asked, offering the room an exit from the narrow corridor in which it now stood. "A minuet, perhaps. Then we may—" His eyes shifted to the Queen Mother. "Conclude with proper thanks." The Queen Mother's silence leaned on the proposal like a hand on a scale. "The program may resume," she said at last, "when the matter that has interrupted it is properly set." She looked to the Lord Chamberlain. "We shall not have rumour write it for us in the morning." A few heads bent to hide the thought of broadsheets and the speed with which ink travelled when fed with scandal. The Lord Chamberlain spoke softly to the Master of Ceremonies and then to the house steward. Instructions began to ripple. The footman returned with the steward of music, who was tugging his cuff into place, his hair disordered the way a man's hair gets when he has been running and wishes no one to notice. The steward of music bowed and added his own plain witness. "I maintain the instrument. It is as it should be. The lady played as one unaccustomed to an audience, but not unaccustomed to keys." A murmur of assent, of surprise, of reluctant respect moved along the row of musicians. The violinist glanced down at his fingers as if to check that they still obeyed him. Eleanor felt the space of the room tilt. Not a lot. Enough. The Queen Mother's decision took shape in the air long before her words gave it body. Authority moves like that. It prepares the body to accept what the voice will say. "Remove the girl from the center," the Queen Mother said. "Not below stairs, to the side. She will wait in view. The prince will remain. We will separate impulse from consequence and address them in turn." The Queen Mother's hand turned a fraction. The Master of Ceremonies inclined his head. The order went out like a well-aimed stone, skipping in ever-widening circles. 2 yeomen, red coats a controlled blaze against the candlelit air, advanced. Not a show of force, a demonstration of order. They did not look at the prince. They looked at the task. Eleanor's breath caught. A small, practical fear broke the surface of her larger terror. Would they take hold of her sleeves and lift her as if she were an object? She was not a dish. She was not a chair. She wanted to walk on her own feet. The house steward, out of his depth now that the matters had risen above his corridor of influence, murmured to her quickly, "Go with them. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look at anyone." She nodded. She did not look at anyone until she looked once. The prince stood with his hands at his back, the line of his shoulders a precision instrument. His gaze met hers for the length of a breath. No smile, no reassurance. Only an attention he had not given anyone else all night. The yeoman reached her bench. One extended a hand, palm up, an offer rather than a grip. The other stood astride behind, eyes steady. "Come," the first said quietly. "You will be placed over there." He indicated the gallery at the side of the musician's dais, a strip of space where those permitted to witness could be seen without being invited to act. She rose and took the offered hand because it was offered as a hand, not as a net. The bench made a small sound behind her. She left the fortepiano open, the fallboard up, the keys uncovered as if to prove that no one wished to hide anything. The instrument kept its counsel. As she moved, the room breathed again, that communal intake that acknowledges decision and prepares for its consequences. The Master of Ceremonies lowered his staff an inch, a prelude to tapping for order, to inviting the program back into motion once the furniture of people had been rearranged. The junior clerk cleared his throat as if to claim more ground. "Your parish record." "Enough," the Lord Chamberlain said, not unkindly. "You will have paper enough before dawn." In the gallery, the housekeeper stood ready to receive Eleanor like a parcel temporarily entrusted to her keeping. She gave the girl a look not of triumph but of solidarity. A woman who keeps a house understands when another woman has done something difficult in a room that does not forgive it. From the dais, the Queen Mother allowed a slow exhale that the closest rows could feel. Order has its own music. She had nearly reassembled it. The Master of Ceremonies drew breath to complete the restoration. The prince did not intend to move. He understood the choreography too well to interrupt it without cause. He understood his mother's patience and the speed at which he could exhaust it. He had meant to stand quiet and permit the evening to land in a place where apology could be dressed like wisdom. He glanced at the girl's hands where they rested against her skirt, noticed the slight tremor, and felt the echo of his own shame return, hotter now that it had been cooled by admiration. He had invited this spectacle. He had asked the room to watch cruelty and call it wit. He could not bear the thought that the next gesture upon her person would be a symbolic removal, even a polite one, accomplished by men in red. "Your Highness," the Master of Ceremonies began, intending to ask a question about the order of the next piece. The prince's mouth declined to answer. It had plans of its own. He felt the room's weight, his mother's attention like a pressure against his ribs. The Lord Chamberlain's composed readiness to write this night into columns that would keep scandal from the breakfast tables. He should keep still. He took one step forward. The step did not belong to him, or it belonged to him more completely than any other motion he had made in a month. It signaled without speech, a line not to be crossed. The yeomen, trained to read lines, halted as if the floor itself had moved beneath their boots. Eleanor felt the halt as a jolt through the fingers she had laced tight. The offered hand hovered near her sleeve and did not complete its purpose. The Queen Mother's chin lifted a degree. The Lord Chamberlain's quill, which he had not revealed to anyone, paused in the air as if ink could smell a story changing shape. "Your Majesty," the Master of Ceremonies said, staff held at that uncertain angle which is neither command nor submission. The room did that strange thing again, and became a single creature that holds its breath until its heart stumbles over the beat. The prince did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He had moved. That was enough, and the whole arrangement of authority trembled at the jolt it had not prepared for. The yeomen extended their hands toward Eleanor's sleeves at the very moment the prince stepped between duty and the girl. The prince's step held the yeomen where they stood. It was not a threat. It was a boundary drawn with the body rather than the tongue. "Your Highness," the nearer yeoman said, low as if to spare him from his own motion. Edward did not look away from Eleanor. He spoke to the room because one does not whisper with 100 ears pricked. "They will not take her by the sleeves," he said. "She will walk where she is told." The Master of Ceremonies remained poised, staff lifted, the silver head trembling in the air only because his arm did. He sought the Queen Mother's eye and found it. She did not flare. She narrowed her attention the way a seamstress narrows a pleat. It had the same effect. It drew fabric into order without cutting it. "Let the girl be placed to the side," she said, the words the same, the method altered by the prince's insistence. "Touch her not. Escort her." The yeoman turned his open hand from Eleanor's sleeve to the space beside her, an invitation rather than a grip. She moved under her own power, past the prince's shoulder. That close, she felt the heat of him and the steadiness he had only just claimed. He did not look at her. He did not have to. The line he had drawn remained between her and whatever would have abridged her. She reached the gallery at the musician's side, where a foot's breadth of raised floor made visibility into a kind of trial. The housekeeper stood there, chin lifted. She did not smile. She would not insult a girl who had walked without clinging by grinning like a market matron. "Stand here," the yeoman said. "You will be seen." Eleanor nodded and set her hands against her apron to stop them from betraying what her face would not. The fortepiano, open, waited where she had left it, mouth uncovered, teeth bared like a gentled animal asked to perform tricks it did not deserve. The Lord Chamberlain murmured to the Master of Ceremonies. The old rhythm of the night, music, dance, wine, talk, had been broken. Another rhythm must replace it, or the whole would fall into chatter and fear. Chatter breeds lies. Fear breeds broadsheets. Edward kept his eyes forward. He had watched men direct companies of soldiers with fewer gestures than he was allowed here. His mother's profile offered him no path. He went to the edge of speech and came back before falling. "Your words," the Queen Mother said, not looking at him at first. "They have weight when spoken where mirrors multiply them." He could have bowed deeper. He could have made a clever apology. He found that the floor under such answers did not hold. "I meant to amuse," he said simply. "And did you?" she asked. He let the question hang. The silence answered with its own sting. A gentleman in the third row could not suffer a vacuum. "It was a jest, ma'am," he offered toward the dais, too loud, too eager to return the evening to its roots. The Queen Mother did not reward him with notice. She had noticed something else. The way the prince's shoulders had altered since the girl played, the way tension had moved out of his jaw. Relief looks like guilt when a mother knows her child's strengths too well. "We shall not conclude with a jest," she said. "We shall set it." The Master of Ceremonies inclined his head, grateful to be handed a form. He lifted his staff a fraction to call assembling attention. "Your Majesties," he began, then corrected himself with precision. "Your Majesty, Your Highness, honored guests." "Not the flourish," the Lord Chamberlain said under his breath, a chiding meant to keep the man from gilding what needed only to be shaped. "Pardon," the Master of Ceremonies said, and cut away the decorations. "We will proceed with an inquiry brief enough to allow the night to close with dignity." A junior clerk, importance rising like yeast under his skin, stepped forward as if to visit the girl with questions that would make her shrink to the size of their answers. He held paper without writing. Paper is a kind of weapon when waved. Parish name, references, he began, repeating what he had already extracted because repetition makes birch rods. Enough, the Lord Chamberlain said. He looked to the steward of music, who had found his place among the musicians. You maintain the instrument? I do. And the girl? She plays as one taught by necessity, the steward said, not by salons. Notes secure, hands steady. He added the thing he could not help adding because the truth is a habit when you handle sound all day. She listens as if the air had a voice. The clerk suppressed the urge to roll his eyes, which is a larger act of rebellion than it looks in a room like this. He turned to the Kapellmeister for a drier aid. Sir? The instrument is true, the Kapellmeister said. She did not invent what she made. She has done it before. Where? The clerk pressed, hungry for a place he could write. In her parish, the housekeeper said first, to stop the clerk from making work of a woman's life the way boys make work of anthills. When the organist was ill, the Lord Chamberlain's head tilted an eighth. He could sense how quickly this could tumble from story to argument to mockery. He did not intend to let it. We turn from whether she can, he said, loud enough to make the corners hear. We know she can. We turn to what was said and what will be done with what was said. Edward felt the turn chew into him. It was what he had been hoping and what he had been fearing, the end of hiding behind admiration. Admiration is easy. Decisions set teeth. Very good, the Queen Mother said. Then we set the question before the company and in its hearing. What stands is that a prince said he would marry a girl if she played. She played. We cannot alter that now. We can only decide whether his words will be taken as mischief to be erased or as commitment to be corrected into proper forms. A murmur rolled, fascinated. People love to watch a man choose between two bad fires. Your Majesty, the Master of Ceremonies ventured cautious. Perhaps the music would soothe the room while we— Order is what soothes a room like this, she replied. Not distraction. Eleanor stood as if the gallery were the smallest island, and the room a sea she did not wish to test her swimming in. She kept her gaze on the instrument, and did not let it stray to the prince, because she could not bear to be the cause of anything in him he would pay for later. And still she felt the pull between them, a thread the length of the parquet. The junior clerk, emboldened by the Queen Mother's structure, allowed himself another question he should not have asked. Miss, did you intend to trap His Highness with your display? He said it with sugar on the tone, but the grains scraped. She answered without apology. I intended to play a tune, and to be seen, he said. She could not deny it. The instrument sat in a room. A woman near the front let her lip curl. Clever, she murmured to a neighbor, loud enough to sting. They grow clever in the fields. The housekeeper's hand twitched, wanting to swat air. The Lord Chamberlain's glance scolded the line back into quiet, without the need of any word. Edward saw the cut land and the girl not bleed. That steadiness made his stomach turn. He had admired men for less. Enough of poking, he said. Not to the clerk, not to the woman, not to any one person, but to the hive. If anyone is to answer for this, it is I. The attention turned. He had expected it. He stood beneath it anyway. He kept his mouth from curling because a boy in him wanted to laugh at risk when it leaned close. A man in him knew better. My words were thoughtless, he said. When a man says in public what he would not say to a priest, he owes the room a correction. And the girl, the Queen Mother said, and made him look where he feared to look. And the girl, he repeated. Would you retract? She asked. She lifted her fan a finger's breadth and then lowered it again, a movement that read to those who knew her as anger cooled by will. To say I would marry a servant because she played is an insult to the institution, he said, the lesson in his throat like a catechism, and an insult to her. Several people nodded, gratified to hear the words they had rehearsed in their heads while he spoke. It let them imagine they had taught him. That does not answer the question, the Queen Mother said softly. He breathed once, then again. He could feel the future watching him from a doorway he could not yet see. He hated being watched by any door. "I will not make a public promise to a private person without counsel," he said. "Nor will I shrug off my speech as if it were as light as powder falling on a wig." The comparison surprised him. It surprised others into honesty. Someone snorted. Someone smiled and remembered he had a face. The Lord Chamberlain recognized a line he could work with. "Your Majesty," he said to the Queen Mother, "the path is plain. We require a formal close to the evening, with music not of accident but of program. After, His Highness will declare before this company his correction in the modesty of proper terms, to be recorded. Any further matter between him and the subject will be set before council at dawn." "Recorded as what?" someone called, brave behind distance. "As what it is," the Lord Chamberlain said. "A retraction of a public mischief, an expression of regard for merit, a request that the room commend itself to good sense." "Fine words," the woman with the curled lip said, but she did not say them aloud this time. The Queen Mother listened to the sentence for shape and drift, then bent it with one more word. "Sanctioned," she said. "We will not have any sound now that is not sanctioned." The Master of Ceremonies dipped his head, grateful to have something to do that was not waiting for people to expose themselves. "The Kapellmeister will select a piece. The lady will perform under his eye. Then—" Edward heard the words and felt the tightness loosen in an odd place. Not his chest, but at the back of his neck, where tension had collected since childhood. Sanctioned. It meant he could make amends in the language that had started the harm. "Then the prince will speak," the Queen Mother said. Eleanor's throat worked. "Play under the Kapellmeister's eye, in front of this room, after having been the cause of it. A sane person would have asked to be taken below stairs and let the floor swallow her. She found that she could not ask. The instrument was open. The night had opened with it. To close one without the other felt wrong, like pinning a bird's wing and telling it to sing to prove it had not been hurt. The Kapellmeister turned to her, his face composed into an expression that meant kindness, without saying the word. "A page," he said softly, and offered the top of a stack, a divertimento whose lines would not offend anyone who did not wish to be moved. She nodded. He placed it on the rack and smoothed it, as if smoothing a wrinkled thought. "We begin when called," he murmured. The Master of Ceremonies lifted his staff high enough to reconnect the parts of the room to the whole. "Attend," he said, and the word ran to the corners like a dry fire. Edward felt his mother watching the space between him and the instrument, as if the air itself were making choices. He looked at the girl and saw the pulse in her neck, the way it found a new rhythm that was not fear's. He did not know yet if it was courage or resignation. The Lord Chamberlain stepped to the left of the fortepiano and produced from his breast a sheet with lines already ruled and a header waiting to be filled. The paper shone wet where ink had tested a corner. He did not announce it. He let those near see. Those far off guessed and were satisfied by their guessing. Eleanor shifted her weight to release the tension in her knees. She looked at the page on the rack and read the first line without yet hearing it. She could hear it by looking. The mind does that when it is trained. She put her hands in the air as if to check they were still attached to her. "Proceed," the Queen Mother said. The Master of Ceremonies brought the staff down toward the floor to strike the parquet and call the piece into being. Edward drew breath to speak and swallowed it. It would turn the air into something unhelpful too soon. He held the breath. He held himself. He watched the silver head arc. The staff hesitated a finger above wood. The Master of Ceremonies judged the room's readiness by the space of that finger, and found it wanting. He raised his arm another inch, and let it hang so that people could imagine themselves the cause of the delay, and thus forgive the delay. The junior clerk's eye traveled to the Lord Chamberlain's paper and grew large with the pleasure of seeing words almost made. The house steward traced the ceremony, as if tracing a map, to the end of his night. The housekeeper stood beside Eleanor and did not move a muscle that could be read as comfort or demand. Eleanor set her fingertips to the key's skin, not yet pressing. The ivory felt warmer than it had before, as if the room's gaze had heated it. Edward watched the slight concavity of her fingers where they met palm, the place where use thickens skin. He had seen such marks on soldiers who carried muskets, on sailors whose ropes had loved and burned their hands, on stewards who kept order until their joints complained. He had not expected to find it beautiful. He did not forgive himself for expecting that at all. The Queen Mother's attention moved to the door for a flash. Duty had a way of tugging at the corners of her mind like a child at a sleeve. She refused to let it pull. She looked back. "Strike," she said, impatience sewn into patience. The Master of Ceremonies allowed the staff to fall that last inch and touch the floor with a sound that was half tap, half promise. "Wait," Edward said. The staff had already met wood, but sound has a way of obeying whoever believes it will. The echo shrank and left a space big enough for a word to stand in. All turned. The Queen Mother's eyelids lowered for the length of a blink. In their language, between them, that blink had been a lecture in other years. He stood like a boy who had listened and a man who had completed the lesson. "I ask a moment," he said, "so that what I say after will not be said in panic." "Your moment," she answered, "is this room." He nodded once, accepting the cleverness and the limit together. "Then I ask that when the music ends, I be allowed to use the proper words for an apology and not the ones the room prefers." "What does the room prefer?" she asked, a tilt at humor so small that only those closest could feel its wind. "Blood," he said. A laugh cracked and then broke into silence again, dragged back by the Lord Chamberlain's glance. The glance behaved like a hook. "It shall be as you ask," the Queen Mother said, and so gave him what she had already planned to allow, a gift that cost her nothing and cost him a little pride, which she could afford to have him spend. The Master of Ceremonies, relieved to be praised for persistence without being praised, lifted his staff again, ready to tap time into obedience. A whisper, wet with malice, slid from the middle of the room, where men who pretend to be brave live when frightened. "She has a teacher," it said, loud enough for many ears. "No peasant learns that alone." Eleanor heard it, and did not let her shoulders rise. Her hands remained where they were. Her pulse did not change. She let the words bounce and fall as they deserve to do when they come from men who believe their position will always give them the last sound. The Kapellmeister answered the whisper without looking for its owner. "I will hear anyone who wishes to dispute time and tune," he said mildly, and none did. Time and tune are tyrants more adored than princes. The Master of Ceremonies brought the staff down once more. The light touched silver and drew a short arc. The room aligned itself to the fall like iron filings to a magnet. "And afterward," the Lord Chamberlain said, gentle into the pause, "the declaration." "The retraction," someone supplied. "Declaration?" Edward corrected, not looking to see who needed the word. "I will not pretend I did not speak." A small stillness gathered behind him, made by people who did not expect to admire a man for choosing to be bound. The Queen Mother watched her son, as one watches a horse that has decided it will take the fence no matter how high one builds it. She could not help the pride that rose, and she cured it with a thought of the morning, of papers, of counsel, of law. "Enough," she said. "Let the piece begin." The staff began its descent for the third and final time. Eleanor lowered her hands, not onto the keys but into the narrow space where sound is born and breath is bargained. Edward shifted his stance, a soldier's reflex shoved into court shoes. He prepared to hold whatever the night built. The note of the staff's tap had not yet finished climbing the mirrored walls when the Queen Mother spoke again, sudden, small, terrible. "After the peace," she said, voice even and carrying, "you will retract this folly before the court tomorrow, or you will learn what consequences mean." The staff's tap had barely kissed the floor when he answered a command with a choice. "Your Majesty," Edward said, the small bow already a risk. "Grant me an interval. Not to disobey, but to keep me from saying what I do not mean." The Queen Mother did not blink this time. That was its own answer. She considered a refusal, found it unworthy of her, and selected a narrower mercy. "5 minutes," she said. "No more." The Master of Ceremonies seized the shape. "Refreshment in the antechambers," he called, the silver head of his staff, sketching a path. "By Her Majesty's pleasure. Remain within call." Order moved like a tide. Chairs whispered back. Silk curled away from the center. Laughter attempted a return and was denied. The orchestra set instruments down with restrained relief, then remained in place. Their station was not wine, but readiness. Yeoman opened the side doors. A faint gust of colder air slid in from the corridor and flattened flame tips before the candles recovered. Edward did not follow the flock. He turned to the Lord Chamberlain. "With me," he said, and did not add please because the man did not require it. Eleanor stood where the yeoman had placed her in the musicians' gallery, uncertain whether to breathe like a person or like a shadow. It seemed that either mode could make an offense. The housekeeper remained at her side, spine straight, hands folded in a way that signaled both containment and care. "Here," the Kapellmeister said softly from below, as if addressing a skittish bird. A moment in the anteroom. The air's less crowded there. "Am I to be taken below?" Eleanor asked, a simple question whose quiet did not reveal the heat under it. "Not while I have breath," the housekeeper murmured. "Not while the instrument remains open." The yeoman offered his open hand again, palm up, not to hurry but to lead. "You will be in view," he reminded her, and his tone traveled beyond his uniform to the place where his own decency lived. She stepped down and moved along the edge of the floor, close enough to the fortepiano to smell its polish, close enough to the prince to feel him turn toward the same small door. He passed without looking at her. It was not disdain. It was a man saving the little he had of control for the one place it might matter. The anteroom received them with beeswax and the residual warmth of crowded candles. A low window revealed a slice of London night pressed black against the panes. The Master of Ceremonies stationed himself at the threshold, a human latch. The Lord Chamberlain took 2 steps in, 3, then paused as if mapping the room's corners for traps. The Kapellmeister entered without ceremony and put his hand on the back of a chair. He did not sit. The house steward and housekeeper stood at the wall, pair of pillars, both out of their depth and determined not to show it. Eleanor remained standing near the small table that had held spare strings and chalk hours before. Her breaths, white at the upper lip, tried to steady themselves and occasionally refused. She felt the absence of the salver at her fingers like a missing weight. Edward came to a halt at a sensible distance and let that distance speak, before he did. When he addressed her, he made his words travel without forcing them. "I owe you something better than this, and I cannot give it yet," he said. She did not ask what better meant. A prince's better could be a number of bad things dressed well. She waited instead, gripping the edges of her own stillness with the tenacity of someone who has held farm gates against the wind. He turned to the Lord Chamberlain. "2 things must be prepared," he said. "One for now, one for morning." The Lord Chamberlain's stillness was that of a man accustomed to writing thunder into minutes. "Say it," he replied. "For now," Edward said, "she will not stand as a servant to be corrected. She will return to the instrument as a guest, under the Kapellmeister's authority. You will draft words to make that true. And for morning?" The Lord Chamberlain did not blink. "You will advise me on the manner of speaking about my own words," Edward said quietly, "before the court and before law. Not to erase them, to carry them properly." The Lord Chamberlain inclined his head, not in agreement, that was too soon, but in recognition of a prince who had set his feet somewhere besides his pride. "I will write," he said, "and I will take the draft to Her Majesty for assent." The Kapellmeister cleared his throat. Because craft seeks its place even when politics thickens the air. There is a divertimento that will reconcile ears wounded by laughter, he said. It will not show her as a curiosity. It will display her as a musician. Select it, Edward said. The house steward found his voice because a man with a house must keep it standing under any weather. Your Highness, he said, gathering the ragged edges into authority, if she is to be seen as guest, she must not wear the apron. The housekeeper had already thought it through to the bone. I have a clean gown, she said, plain. No frills to offend anyone's measure. It will make her ours and not theirs for the space of a quarter hour. Eleanor looked down at the crease she had smoothed earlier and felt the odd ache of being helped without being asked who she was. I have nothing fine, she said, as apology and defiance both. Nor do we require it, the housekeeper said, and the look she sent the house steward dared him to contradict her. He did not. Edward watched the exchange and felt something loosen at the base of his throat. Not forgiveness, not yet. Something more like a muscle he had never used discovering a function. He wanted to turn to Eleanor and say one true sentence he would not regret in daylight. You played, he said, and the words sounded small to him and vast to her. I did, she answered. Why did you not flee? The question came out bare. It startled him with how it betrayed his expectation of cowardice and revealed his fear of it in himself. I was told to do a thing, she said, and a muscle near his left eye jumped because he recognized the language of duty spoken without the coins that usually pay for it. I did it. He looked at her hands where they rested at her sides. The nails were clean because the housekeeper was proud. The skin was nicked because life's work does not wear gloves. He felt heat roll in his belly at the remembrance of his own sentence in the hall, the sentence that had landed like a boot on a throat. His next breath had to be measured so that he did not speak like a boy begging. He had no right to beg anything of her. The Lord Chamberlain spared them both a little time. Your Majesty, he said toward the doorway, sensing before seeing the Queen Mother herself at the threshold, drawn by the gravity of choice. She did not cross into the anteroom. She was not required to. Her presence entered before her body. Speak, she said. She did not repeat the 5 minutes. She can measure time without numbers. Edward met her gaze and did not tilt his chin up as he had taught himself to do when he wished to appear the taller. I ask sanction to close the evening with a piece under the Kapellmeister's authority, he said, with Miss Whitcomb as invited performer. Miss Whitcomb, the Queen Mother repeated, tasting the name and the title all at once. Very well. She could afford a yes that cost her nothing. She will stand as a musician for the space of a piece. And then? I will address the room, he said, in proper words. In the words we shape, she said, and he inclined his head. You will retract tomorrow, she added, a reminder laid like a lace over iron. I will submit to counsel, he said, which was not the same, and she allowed it to stand in this small space because the large one would not spare him in the morning. The Lord Chamberlain moved to the little table and slid a spare sheet before him, drawing from his coat a pen he kept, because habit is a kind of armor. He wrote quickly, not because haste improves words, but because the interval had been given a length, and men like him respect measures. The Kapellmeister turned the top sheet of his stack over and smoothed the next page with his palm. His fingers carried chalk that left a tiny smear at the margin. He did not apologize. He had been using tools while others used people. The housekeeper left the room and returned with a gown on her arm so swiftly that Eleanor could not imagine how she had found a cloth this clean where so many hands had been doing work. Here, she said, and set the dress on the chair. Change behind the screen. There had always been a screen. Even a house that belongs to someone else keeps such small mercies. Eleanor hesitated, then took the gown. She did not look at the prince as she moved behind the screen. She held herself still before she loosened ties that had been double-knotted in a kitchen where speed mattered. She slipped out of the apron and the coarse bodice, the room's cool air finding the sweat that had gathered beneath the stays. She dressed with the care one uses at dawn, so as not to wake people who must rest to work again. Edward looked toward the window to discipline his eyes while cloth whispered behind the screen. He stared at the dark and told himself stories about rain on cobbles. He had not thought to guard the room like this before. He understood why one should. When Eleanor stepped back into the room, the housekeeper put quick hands to sleeves and hem. "Turn," she said, and Eleanor turned, uncertain whether to be grateful or afraid. The gown was not elegant. It was decent. It made her look like a woman who worked in rooms where people glanced and looked away because she was part of the furniture and not of the show. That was, tonight, a kind of armor. "Shoes?" the house steward asked, at the edge of a practical panic. "She will wear her own," the housekeeper said. "They fit, and they have carried her through worse floors than this." Eleanor stilled under the housekeeper's hands, and then lifted her chin a fraction when the woman stepped back. The Kapellmeister, perhaps to avoid making anyone cry, lifted the page and spoke as if to a colleague. "You know how to follow a figure," he said. "Yes," she answered. "You will listen for my breath," he said. "I will not lead you wrong." She almost smiled. "I have learned to listen to breaths." The Lord Chamberlain dried the ink with a small shake of the paper and held it so the Queen Mother could read without coming farther in. "Her Majesty grants temporary patronage for the space of the evening," he read aloud, letting the words fill the corners with authority, "to Eleanor Whitcomb, who will perform under the Kapellmeister's supervision as guest. Her station as servant is suspended for the duration of the performance." "Proper," the Queen Mother said, "and afterward, her station returns until it is altered by the proper hand." She used the word hand, so he would remember that his did not hold the pen alone. Eleanor heard the suspension, and felt both the weight of the chain and the mercy of being allowed to breathe for a quarter hour. She looked at Edward because politeness required it. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a man who had taken more weight upon his shoulders than he had intended to name in public. "You should have left me below stairs," she said. Not to accuse, but to show him the cost of the path he had chosen for both of them. "I tried," he said, and then corrected himself because he had not. "I thought of it, and I did not." "Do you regret it?" she asked. He searched for an acceptable lie and found none that would not foul his tongue. "No," he said, and then quieter. "And yes." "That is 2 answers," she said. "It is the truth," he replied. The house steward shifted, uncomfortable with the intimacy of honesty in a room where tapestries could remember what was said. The housekeeper took half a step, not to interrupt, but to remind the room that time was moving, while speech attempted to stop it. "Your Majesty," the Master of Ceremonies called softly from the door. "The company waits. The interval is at its end." "Bring them back to the floor," the Queen Mother said. "Seat the ladies. Raise the light." The Lord Chamberlain folded the paper and held it like a blade in its sheath. The Kapellmeister placed his page beneath his arm and nodded to Eleanor. "We will go," he said. "Breathe when I do." Eleanor followed him out, the housekeeper at her elbow to keep the gown from brushing a puddle of spilled wine near the threshold. Edward waited for the Queen Mother to turn so that he could walk 3 steps behind, the place where sons belong when mothers lead. The Lord Chamberlain trailed with the paper and the sense that the next hour could be written into a saving, if men behaved, and the music did its share. The ballroom had transformed in the space of the interval by the smallest corrections. The fortepiano had been edged a half-foot forward so that the instrument would address the room squarely. Chairs had been aligned as if a surveyor had passed through with string. Candles had been pinched and relit to banish any sign of an interruption that had bordered on scandal. People returned without the arrogance of earlier laughter. They came like witnesses rather than consumers. The Master of Ceremonies released them into silence rather than sound. The orchestra raised instruments to shoulders and chins and looked to the Kapellmeister for the twitch of muscle that begins effort without making a show of it. Eleanor took the place marked for her. It was not the bench she had left moments ago when the room had turned on a jest. It was the same wood, the same keys, and yet it had become a public square, a dock, a tiny stage upon which a person could be remade into a function. The housekeeper slipped behind the gallery rail, confident now that she could protect nothing but her expression. The house steward set himself near the door through which servants move on invisible errands. He would hold that threshold, as if holding water in a sieve. Edward did not stand at her shoulder. He moved aside by 2 paces and a half, a measure learned in drill, and then added another small, human half-step to announce that some distances were chosen and not imposed. He kept his hands at his back and relaxed them only when he realized his fists had formed without asking him. The Queen Mother sat, not on the dais where the first course had been paraded, but a little forward and to the left, where she could see musician and son in one pane. She folded her fan and placed it on her knee. Her face found a calm that had cost her something. She wore it like a borrowed shawl. The Lord Chamberlain moved to stand near the fortepiano, not to intrude, but to show the room with his presence that words had been written to encircle the act, that nothing now occurred without a frame. The Master of Ceremonies lifted his staff and did not need to strike. The company was already with him. He gestured rather than tapped, an invitation rather than a command. The Kapellmeister inclined his head to Eleanor. She answered with the smallest nod. He inhaled. She matched his breath. The first notes waited, a flock ready to startle if approached too quickly. Edward's attention fixed on the place where her fingers hovered over the keys. He did not will them. He did not pray for them. He simply allowed himself to know that his fate had tunneled into a narrow passage in which one must walk upright or crawl. He chose. The Queen Mother felt the room's expectancy crystallize into a shape she could carry into morning. She did not smile. She let her chest rise and fall once, a concession to the body's need to remind the mind that it lives. The Lord Chamberlain's hand lay upon the folded paper. He did not press. He was a man who knew when weight helps and when it ruins. The housekeeper held herself still enough to make any seamstress proud. The house steward rehearsed a short speech for the master of the house that would tell the story without making it a confession. Eleanor's fingers settled. The ivory felt familiar, as if she had left her hands there minutes before and only now remembered to return them. She waited for the breath, the one the Kapellmeister had promised, and then for the smallest tilt of his head. Behind and to her right, Edward's eyes did not leave her. He allowed the shame to remain present without using it as self-punishment. It would have been vanity to nurse it. He needed all his attention for the next act of choosing. When the Master of Ceremonies opened his mouth to name the piece, the sound that left it was not announcement but trust. The room received it and prepared to translate it into listening. Eleanor drew breath and prepared to play. Eleanor lowered her hands to the keys and let the room fall away until only the breath beside her mattered. The Kapellmeister inhaled. She matched him. His hand hovered, almost imperceptibly, then flicked the smallest permission. She began. The first notes were modest, a clear line anyone might hum. She set them like stepping stones, each one close enough to trust, far enough to feel the space between. The ivory answered with a tone dry and honest, like good bread. She kept the pulse steady so the room could place its feet on her rhythm and not fear a fall. Sound carried up to the mirrors and returned softened. She did not let the reflection steal her attention. She let her left hand lay the path, while her right drew a curve above it, a simple arc that made the candles seem to lean closer. The violins entered as if they had opened a door with care. They did not crowd her. The violas laid a velvet underlay. She felt the orchestra as a warmth at her back, and for the first time since the jest, she allowed safety to rise a finger's breadth in her throat. She did not look at the prince. She did not look at the Queen Mother. She let her eyes rest on the page and then, when the page had offered all it could, on the hinge where wood and sound met. The instrument had been waiting all evening to be used properly. She granted it that dignity and took some for herself. She shifted a phrase by a hair, a grace that would pass unnoticed by those who listen with their eyebrows. Those who live on notes heard it. The Kapellmeister's breath approved. She let the figure lift in the second bar and glanced toward the melody she had made before, then withheld it. Promise is sweeter when not taken at once. A cough, the dry kind pride produces, rose in the back. It died alone. The housekeeper's gaze did that. Men sense when they will be pinned by a look-after. Eleanor's mouth softened in gratitude without changing shape. She took the second subject as written and let her wrist fall in a controlled weight on the downbeats. The fortepiano's action replied with that charming faint bark the instrument makes when pleased. She did not hide it. Truth is not impolite. At the end of the first section, she allowed a breath long enough for the room to decide whether to move. It chose to remain. She returned to the theme and opened it a degree wider, tilting a chord so that the minor thread she had tucked hours earlier in defiance could be glimpsed under the lace. It made the candles seem cooler for a heartbeat. She warmed them again almost at once. One cannot humiliate the night further and still call it healing. Her hands knew their work. The training had been stolen in hours when other girls slept or mended. The work had been done with fingers that carried water upstairs one trip too many. She felt the burn of that history and poured it into a trill that was precise without vanity. The trill skimmed the surface of the air like a swallow over water. Someone's breath caught. A man who had arranged himself to be unimpressed adjusted his weight and scowled at his own foot. She reached the turn and found him there without looking. The prince had moved closer by a pace when the music asked for a page. He did not speak. He waited. She felt, before she saw, his fingers near the paper. She dared a glance not to his face but to the corner of the page. He turned it cleanly, late by not an instant, early by not a blink. The gesture had an apology folded into it that no sentence could have managed. She played through the turn with a steadiness born of that small kindness. The room understood without words. The prince had moved from authorship to service. It steadied them as much as it steadied her. The Queen Mother's fan did not open. It rested, forgotten, on her knee. The Lord Chamberlain's hand eased on the folded paper. The Master of Ceremonies permitted himself one private exhale, inaudible even to his own ears. Eleanor shaped the development with care. She did not permit herself to show off cleverness. A room can sour at a girl too bold, where it applauds a man for the same sin. She allowed the theme to visit shadows and returned it to light with a discipline that made the journey feel earned. The orchestra followed without tugging. The second violins knew exactly where to place their weight so that she would not have to fight to be heard. At the cadence before the final section, she chose. She could conclude as expected and satisfy etiquette, or she could ask the room to remember the melody born of mockery and turn to grace. She listened to the Kapellmeister's breath. He inhaled with full lungs and held. He was handing her the night. She folded her first melody, hers, into the approved music as if it had always belonged there. It did not jar. It fit the seam. The room recognized it as one recognizes a person met in daylight after passing them by candlelight once. The laughers heard what they had tried to stamp out and found they could not. The kind-hearted heard what they had wished to hear again and sat up straighter as if to welcome it. The doubtful listened and lost a little of their doubt, not because policy had changed, but because sound had corrected posture. Eleanor did not swell. She did not bang. She let the phrase speak with the clarity of a person telling the truth in a room used to theater. The prince bowed his head half an inch. She saw it out of the corner of her eye and decided not to weep. The tears would come later, in a room with less gold. The last bars approached, the safe ones where a performer can hide. She refused to hide. She placed the final chord with weight and lifted as if placing a letter into someone's hand. She did not snatch. She did not linger. She let the tone hang its tiny bell and die in its own time. Silence. It had a sound. It had a shape. She felt it around her like water when you walk into a river, and the current moves against your calves and tells you to trust your footing. She lifted her hands from the keys by degrees and laid them in her lap. She did not bow. She stood only when the master of ceremonies moved a quarter step, and the room remembered how to breathe. Applause began at the edges, careful, then rose across the center, careful no more. It was not raucous. It had gratitude in it. People who had never thanked anyone for music in their lives found their palms together and did not feel stupid. Eleanor turned her head enough to find the Kapellmeister and give him the acknowledgement due. His chin dipped, no more. She turned toward the housekeeper and received a look like a benediction disguised as a scolding. Do not become proud, child. Pride ruins good hems. She turned at last toward the prince and met eyes that did not know how to hide. He stepped forward, not to take her arm, but to address the room with her still at the instrument. He did not climb a dais. He stood where those who have erred should stand, near the act that corrected them. Her Majesty graciously permitted the peace, he said, turning his voice so that it carried without striking. You have been patient while we put our house in order. I owe you clarity, and I owe this lady thanks. He looked not at the crowd first, but at Eleanor. Your hands have done tonight what our words could not, he said, and his mouth twitched at the edge. Not amusement, not sorrow, something that had both flavors. You played where I had made sport. He turned to the Queen Mother. Ma'am. She let him continue. She could have folded him into silences. She did not. I spoke in mischief, he said. I will not pretend I did not. In a room where mirrors make a sentence multiply, I said a thing that made laughter easy and honor hard. I will not have the last act be laughter. A murmur ran, not dissent, interest. Even those who disliked him liked a man who walks back into his own snare and lifts it off a companion. I asked, he went on, and was granted authority to place Miss Whitcomb for this hour, not as servant, but as musician. If I could revoke this difference now and make it permanent by whim, I would not. We do not change stations by impulse, not hers, not mine. That is not respect. That is vanity dressed as mercy. The Lord Chamberlain's chin lowered a hair. The prince had used a sentence he could carve into something that would outlast the room. I can do what is mine to do, Edward said, and turned to Eleanor again, as if to show that saying so was not to hide behind process. I can make tonight safe. I can make tomorrow honest. I can keep my word where it is worth keeping. I will do all three. He placed his signet ring on the dark wood of the fortepiano's lid, not as a stage trick, but as a pledge that politicians understand. It lay there, a small gold circle catching the candle's tremor. Let it stay during the coda, if you will, he said to Eleanor, so I do not forget where I laid it. She looked at the ring and felt the oddness of being trusted with an object that had stamped consequence on paper all her life without her seeing it done. It will be safe, she said. He faced the room. I declare my admiration for Miss Whitcomb's merit, he said. I ask Her Majesty to grant her the Kapellmeister's patronage this night and onward, that no harm come to her for what my tongue began. I commit to present the matter of my own words where it belongs in the morning, and to abide counsel rather than appetite. The Queen Mother let the silence hold so his sentence could find every ear. Then she inclined her head. Patronage is granted, she said. The Kapellmeister will take her under his protection. As for the rest, the petition shall be received at dawn. She met her son's gaze in that finish and allowed the room one glimpse of feeling. Not triumph, and not resentment. Relief, tangled with duty. A few lips pursed. One gentleman, drunk on cleverness more than wine, looked prepared to mutter. He did not, because the housekeeper's stare happened to cross his face just then, and she was the kind of woman who would remember him beyond tonight and make his soup greasy for a month if provoked. The Lord Chamberlain, in the same moment, shifted his weight and allowed the light to find the paper in his hand, as if it were a sword unsheathed. Resistance deflated by inches. Respect, reluctant and then content, replaced it. Edward returned to the instrument, not to sit, but to set the coda in motion in the only way he could. He turned the last page for her again. It was a small service, yet large in a room like this. He did not look to see who approved. "Play," he said to her softly, and the word had in it a thank you he could not place elsewhere. She touched the keys and drew the melody born of mockery back into the center, now transfigured by sanction. No rebellion coiled in it now. It was not chastened either. It was itself. The phrase bloomed, paired, breathed. He stood beside her and chose to be the background to someone else's truth in a room designed to make him the whole picture. She ended with a cadential turn that felt like a door closed gently. He did not clap first. He waited for the room to remember how to answer properly. It did, fuller now. The applause had dignity mixed with gratitude. The master of ceremonies, sensing a night salvageable, lifted his staff and did not need to use it. Edward offered his hand then, not to own, but to escort. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "may I?" The question, simple and public, felt larger to her than any vow whispered in a garden could have been. "You may," she said, and placed her fingers in his. The contact was brief, chaste, seen, enough. They turned toward the Queen Mother, who rose, not to embrace, never that, but to receive a bow, and to return it with the measurement that admits change without losing control. "Your work has spared us discourtesy," the Queen Mother said to Eleanor, who had no language for that magnitude of sentence and so curtsied with the neatness of someone who has learned to make body and soul agree for a moment. The Kapellmeister stepped forward and offered a small page torn from the edge of his own book, the margin where no note would be missed. "A beginning," he said. She took it as if it were porcelain. The housekeeper, from the edge, pretended to scold her with a glance for holding something so small as if it could shatter, then blinked twice to keep from crying. Edward lifted the ring from the lid and closed his hand on it, then opened the clasp again. "One more service," he said to the room, as if he required their witness to keep himself honest. He set the ring down once more, then withdrew his fingers and left it. "Until dawn," he said under his breath. She heard. "Until dawn," she echoed, not because she believed in dawns promised by princes, but because she believed in ones earned by work. The Lord Chamberlain approached the Queen Mother with the paper. She touched the seal. The Master of Ceremonies announced dispersal in the same tone he had used at the start of the night to welcome people. Only this time, it sounded like a prayer answered. Musicians began to set instruments aside. The yeomen stood easy. The house steward exhaled for the first time in an hour and felt lightheaded. Faces changed as they left. Men who had intended to laugh at breakfast found themselves planning to talk about music instead. Ladies who had readied barbs put them away and looked forward to telling cousins about a prince who had learned to stand still beside a piano. The good ones filed the night under miracles. The sensible ones filed it under laborious salvation. Both left satisfied. Eleanor remained a moment longer at the bench because endings need a little space to become true. She placed her palm on the closed fallboard as if greeting the instrument with thanks after work done. The wood was warm. It carried a pulse she could almost feel. The ring lay above, bright as a possibility, dull as a duty, small and not small. Edward waited at a distance that felt like mere inches and an entire law book's thickness. "You will be guarded to rooms befitting a musician," he said. "For tonight." "For tonight," she said, echoing for the last time so that the echo would not own her tomorrow. "My thanks, Your Highness." "Do not thank me for fixing what I broke," he said. "Thank the music." She allowed herself a smile then, small, private, and not private at all, because 100 eyes had squinted to see it. "I have already," she said. He looked as if he might reach to brush a loose curl from her temple. He did not. He let his hand fall open and made do with turning the thought into a sentence that would not embarrass either of them in memory. "You have altered this room," he said. "You have altered yourself," she replied, and then, because she could not carry the weight of his face any farther tonight, she lowered her gaze to the ring and the wood and thought of the parish, of the keys worn smooth, of the days to come that would not be silent. The Queen Mother passed near enough that her perfume, faint and orderly, drew a line in the air. She stopped beside the instrument and touched the lid with the tip of her glove. "We will speak in the morning," she said to Edward, meaning counsel and papers and consequences. Then, to Eleanor, she added without sweetness and without edges, "You will report to the Kapellmeister at 9. Do not be late." "I am never late," Eleanor said before remembering where she stood. The Queen Mother's mouth moved, almost a smile, and then it was gone. People thinned. The orchestra left in pairs, tired and content. The Master of Ceremonies restored the staff to its corner with a tenderness it did not receive on ordinary nights. The housekeeper came forward and quietly assessed the hem of the borrowed gown, then nodded, pleased that it had survived glory better than most gowns survive soup. Edward raised a hand, and the yeoman nearest understood the signal as a request and not an order. "See Miss Whitcomb to the musicians' rooms," he said. "Stay until the housekeeper sends you away." The yeoman bowed as if he had been asked to escort a duchess. Eleanor straightened, ready to step away from the fortepiano as one leaves a friend to rest. The Kapellmeister caught her eye and opened his mouth, then closed it, perhaps out of fear that any more words would cause the thin skin over his composure to tear. He inclined his head instead. She answered the same. Edward did not move until she moved. He watched the way she lifted her skirt a fraction to avoid a sticky patch of wine on the floor, as if the action were a kind of music he had never heard before. She passed him. He did not speak. He did not need to. Everything that could be said tonight had been said without ruin. At the doorway she paused and looked back at the instrument. The ring still lay on the lid, catching and releasing small stars of candlelight. She looked at the prince, and then at the Queen Mother. She weighed propriety and need. "Your ring," she said softly. "Leave it," Edward replied, and his voice carried enough for the room to learn the lesson. "I want to see in the morning where I placed it. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.